Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer is now recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the minority leader. The gentleman is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments we just heard on the floor from my colleague from Tennessee talking about Dr. Hansen's retirement, a gentleman who has faced a great deal of criticism, including many from this Congress, because of his forceful presentation of his point of view. And time after time after time, Dr. Hansen has been proven correct. This is the most important issue that we're really not debating in Congress. There are a group of us here who have formed the Safe Climate Caucus to be able to promote this discussion. Today we extended an invitation to the leadership of the Commerce and Energy Committee to join us on the floor of the House for a bipartisan debate, encouraging our Republican colleagues to come to the floor to be able to deal with this issue that frankly deserves to be in the spotlight. We're not aware of any Republican member who's spoken on the floor of the House about the dangers of climate change or the need to reduce emissions and prepare for its impact in this entire session of Congress. In fact, as near as we can determine, no Republican member of Congress has even uttered the words climate change on the floor in this Congress. It's, I suppose, better that they're not talking about it at all than what we had in the last Congress, where the Republican-led House of Representatives voted 53 times to block action on climate change. My Republican colleagues voted to defund research, to block action by the EPA to control pollution, to prevent energy efficiency measures from going into effect. Remember, one of the most comical was the assault on light bulb efficiency, an efficiency standard that was developed, admittedly, when Democrats were in charge, but signed with legislation that we worked out with the Bush administration. That was certainly a travesty. It was interesting. The industry looked at them and shrugged and said, "We're moving on. We're not going back to produce less energy efficient light bulbs." They voted to stop the administration from encouraging developing countries to do this part. This year, the Republican members of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee of primary jurisdiction over energy policy, even voted against holding hearings with scientists who could explain the role of climate change in causing extreme weather, drought, heat waves, and wildfires. That's why we've created the Safe Climate Caucus, to work to end the conspiracy of silence here in the House about the dangers of climate change. But we sincerely hope, that our Republican colleagues would join us here on the floor of the House in one of these special orders to discuss our various approaches. If they don't agree with human-caused impacts of extreme weather events, engage in the debate to explain why. If they do agree that we are at least having extreme weather events, whether or not they're human-caused, let's debate what we should do to be protecting us from those impacts. The American public deserves no less. So until we're able to engage our Republican colleagues in a spirited, thoughtful debate on the floor of the House, we will continue pointing out the problems that we face, the risks, the dangers, the paths forward. Because in 2012, there were over 3,500 weather-related records set due to extreme heat, rain, drought, cold, and wind. The American public has seen that. They've suffered the consequences. They're concerned. Hurricane Sandy was one of just 11 weather disasters last year in the United States that caused more than $1 billion of losses. A total of over $60 billion, which taxpayers are being forced to help assume the burden. Here in Washington, D.C., we set another record. 90 degrees today for April 10th. At the same time, there are snowstorms in Colorado. 2012 was the 36th consecutive year with a global temperature above the 20th century average. The last time there was a year with a global temperature that wasn't above average was 1976, before Jimmy Carter was elected president. We were celebrating the bicentennial. Most of our staff here in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill has never experienced a year where temperatures weren't above average. Now, just because our Republican friends don't want to debate it, just because they have fought to prevent our initiative, doesn't mean that it's not having an economic impact. The United States Congress has appropriated $188 billion for climate-related disasters over the last 3 years. Just 2 months ago, the Government Accountability Office released a GAO report listing the federal government's vulnerability to climate change impacts as one of its greatest areas of potential risk. Climate change could increase investment portfolio risk by 10% over the next 2 decades by disrupting supply chains. Those of us in Congress who are noticing these problems, these changes, these challenges, are not alone. According to the Gallup poll last month, 58% of the American public worry a fair amount or a great deal about climate change and its impacts. 62% of Republicans believe that America should take steps to address climate change. Monday, Arnold Schwarzenegger joined the list of Republican politicians who now acknowledge that climate change is a serious concern, speaking at the Price School of Public Policy in California. Governor Schwarzenegger said, if we're smart, we listen to our doctors. If we're stupid, we ignore our doctors. And it takes a heart attack to realize that we should listen. Schwarzenegger said the National Climate Assessment Report is our physical, and these scientists can give us a prescription for what we need to do to improve our climate. It's our duty to listen to them and encourage action. Action all over the country. And Republican Governor Schwarzenegger is to be commended for his vision and stepping forward. Another of my colleagues from California is with us here this evening, and I noticed that he may be willing to step in. He's been greatly concerned about infrastructure, climate, the environment, in a long and distinguished career in California politics and now here in Congress. We're honored that you'd be willing to join us, and I would be happy to yield to you if you would like to join in this conversation.
Mr. Blumenauer, I would be honored to participate in this conversation. And Mr. Speaker, it's always a great pleasure and in fact important that those of us, 435 of us that have been elected to represent the American citizens, rise on the floor to speak to issues of great importance. When all is debated, and at the end of those debates, I suppose we ought to say, was that important? We debated earlier about a piece of this puzzle, but this is the most consequential issue facing the entire globe. Climate change is a very, very real challenge for the human race. In the early 90s, I was Deputy Secretary at the Department of Interior and was asked by the President and Vice President at the time to join in developing a strategy for America at the Kyoto Conference, which was the second international effort to come to grips with this issue. And we studied the various ramifications of climate change, and we predicted that what you just described in your opening statement, Mr. Blumenauer, would happen. And indeed it is happening. The climate is changing. It is warmer. There are more extreme events. And the impact is already being perceived in those things that are most unnoticed, which is the change in the vegetation and in the flora and fauna throughout the United States. As you hike through the mountains of the Sierras, you have to go a little higher to see species, both animal and fauna, that lived at a lower elevation. They're moving up the mountain, those that can. Those that can't, for example, some species of trees and plants aren't able to get up, remove their roots and move up the mountain, and they're simply going to become extinct. Now, what do we do about it? Well, there are many things we can do without actually harming the economy. In fact, there are many things we can do that will cause the economy to grow. For example, conservation. Conservation of energy is an enormously important way to conserve our money, our energy supplies, and reduce carbon emissions, because much of the energy in the United States actually comes from carbon emissions. For example, how about better mileage in our cars? Thankfully, we have President Obama and the Democratic administration that has taken very aggressive steps to reduce the consumption of gasoline and diesel in our automotives and trucks, thereby conserving and saving us money and simultaneously reducing greenhouse gas emission. There are many, many other things. One bill we took up on the floor today that passed, my amendment wasn't adopted, but nonetheless, it is the small hydro, using hydropower wisely where we can without harming the environment, but also adding to the energy production. Moving away from coal, which we know to be the single biggest source of carbon from power plants as we generate electricity. Moving initially to gas-fired power plants, which have significantly less carbon emissions, and in that process taking the steps to move to renewable power sources of all kinds. Hydro where it makes sense. How about wind turbines? I don't have the statistics with me today, but we've made an enormous advancement in wind energy and solar energy. And by the way, if we're going to do that in the United States with our tax policies and give a tax rebate or credit, then we ought to make it in America, have those turbines and solar panels made in America, so that we not only do what is right by the environment, but we also do what is right by the American workers, so that we can rebuild our American manufacturing. There are many, many other concepts, all of which grow the economy. Don't harm the economy at all, but rather grow the economy, reducing emissions, not only carbon emissions, but from the coal-fired power plants, reducing rather dangerous substances like mercury and arsenic. So we should move these things forward. Unfortunately, we are running up against a block of votes on the right side of this House, not right on policy, but rather in location, where they are blocking the efforts that we must make to come to grips with this. So my point here is that while this is a fundamental problem for this nation, it's also a fundamental opportunity for America to grow a new economy. We just heard read here on the floor not more than 30 minutes ago the statement by the President of his new budget in which he makes this point, that by addressing climate change, we also address the need to rebuild the American economy and to set it on a path where we can compete and sell these technologies and products all around the world, because this is not just an American problem, this is a national, international problem, and all of us, wherever we are, whatever country we are in, we must take action. We must take action. We cannot let this slide. And my plea, as you made yours, Mr. Blumenauer, to our Republican colleagues is, let's debate this. If you don't believe this is a problem, come to the floor and tell us why this is not a problem. If you do not believe that we should manufacture wind turbines and solar panels here in the United States and deploy them rather than continuing with the coal-based economy, then tell us why. I wait for that debate, and I'll join you in it, Mr. Blumenauer. Thank you for the privilege of joining you, and I see that we have another colleague, and we may reopen the West Coast, East Coast show. Mr. Blumenauer, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Congressman Gamendi. Thank you for your comments and for your leadership in your native state of California on so many different levels in pressing this point. And your observation that there's a great deal of economic opportunity. The installed wind energy has exploded in recent years. And in fact, not only are we producing the energy here in the United States, it's American wind, where it's not dollars that we're exporting.
If I might interrupt you for a second, there are those that would claim that this place is also a windy chamber.
And part of what we need to be harvesting. That's why I have a small wind energy tax credit that I think we could install here in the House chamber. But part of what we've done with the Recovery Act has increased dramatically the amount of manufacturing that's here in the United States for that installed energy. Now, we are joined with one of our colleagues, Congressman Tonko from New York, who has, before he came to Congress, where he's been very active in these areas, had his own series of activities providing leadership and technology and energy efficiency, and we'd be honored for you to join in the conversation.
Thank you, Representative Blumenauer, for leading us in this discussion. I appreciate the fact that you've brought together this thoughtful discussion, this dialogue on how we need to embrace a stronger sense of stewardship with our environment that ties to our energy policy, that ties to our economic recovery opportunities. I have to first and foremost mention, you're right, I headed the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority in the state of New York, my last workstation before serving here in the House, and totally surrounded by consummate professionals who make it their role, their job, their advocacy, their vocation to make a difference with energy policy that allows us to be stronger stewards of our environment and to advance this effort for renewables, for innovation that allows us to reduce that mountain of electrons that we require for the workplace, the home place, for quality of life, and allows us to use that in much more useful, measured terms so that efficiency, energy efficiency, is seen as our fuel of choice, that comes before any of our energy thinking. And that provides for a greener outcome that allows for us to address this phenomenon of climate change. Now, whether or not you believe in climate change, and to me the scientific evidence is insurmountable, but see it as an opportunity for jobs, good paying jobs, jobs that advance research and innovation and intellect and ideas as an economy that can then transition us into a very powerful bit of economic recovery. But I want to make certain that I introduce onto this floor the discussion about Mother Nature and its grip on the 20th Congressional District, and before that, before redistricting, when I represented the 21st, Irene and Lee, as major storms, impacted my region. People had lost, Representative Blumenauer, everything for which they ever worked. Houses swept into the river through storms that just, through the force of Mother Nature, overpowered communities. Many houses destroyed, heritage crown jewel items in the region that were visitation centers, destinations, destroyed. A covered bridge, historic in nature, wiped away through the ravages of water. This was a profound impact. Lives lost, many injured. Communities are still rebuilding. Businesses are coming back. Households are still abandoned. The efforts have been powerful. We've witnessed volunteerism to the nth degree, a tremendous statement about the human heart to respond to needs of neighbors and at times total strangers. And then this year, seeing what had happened with the ravages of Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, that impacted New England, impacted Metro New York, New Jersey, and beyond, Pennsylvania. These are atypical situations. Tornadoes, tropical storms, hurricanes as far north as upstate New York had been unheard of. And so there is a statement that Mother Nature is making. And we are faced with this climate change phenomenon, a concept that we need to address in scientific measure, in ways that allow us to constructively build a plan that allows us to move forward, again, by enhancing the opportunities for job creation. You know, what I had seen through the advocacy at NYSERDA, the State Energy Research and Development Authority, was this effort for us to be the keepers of the funds that would go towards innovating and transitioning into a better reliance on renewables, using in a benign way the environment qualities that surround us, the winds, the sun, the soil, the water, in a way that allows us to respond to the needs that we have as a society for energy, and to do it through intellect. And the intellectual capacity of our nation is something we constantly cultivate through education, training, higher ed, apprenticeship programs. These are forces that can then bear good news of invention, of innovation. You know, I have the Renewable Center for GE, the International Center, in the heart of my district. We have the R&D lab in Niskayuna. All of these places are working in a way to allow for us to look at new battery design, the linchpin to innovation that allows us to embrace perhaps storage of intermittent power, that it makes it more predictable and of more useful capacity. Investment in cable that allows for less line loss in the delivery and the transporting of electrons to the source. There are many, many ways that we can be significantly sensitive to the demands on our society for energy, and not to be wasteful, to be innovative in our approach, and to green up our thinking. I'll say this, and I know we have others that want to speak, but when I first arrived here in 2009, after the 2008 election for my first term to serve in the House, I was able to sit at the table when we formed, as Democrats, SEEK, the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition. It's a group of like-minded thinkers who want to take us in green direction with progressive politics and enable us to think outside the barrel, to be able to be clever in our approach to provide for new ways to meet society's needs, to open the door to job creation, to provide for soundness of outcomes in a sustainable way that allows us to make a very bold and noble statement. And that is typically this, that we inherit this environment for the moment. And it is our task, I believe, morally, to hand it over to the next generations in even better stead. And that is a daunting challenge these days. It's a daunting challenge, but in my heart I believe that we can accomplish what we need to accomplish. We can respond to the challenge by opening up to new thinking and to not be restrained and restricted by status quo or by the disbelief that these things are happening right before our very eyes, right in the heart of our communities. And I wanted to make certain that I share the impact on my district of Mother Nature and the clarion call to respond with urgency and with in-depth knowledge driven by the passion to make a difference, because there is always that pioneer spirit in America, and we're at our best when we embrace that inspiration and move forward as a nation.
Thank you, Congressman Tonko. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your leadership on this issue before and after you joined Congress. And I like the notion about thinking outside the barrel.
Well, you're a great leader also, so thank you for leading us in this discussion and leading us routinely on sound transportation corridors, including those bicycles that don't pollute.
Indeed. Well, the cheapest electron is one that we don't have to use.
Exactly.
And if we just double American energy efficiency, we can cut carbon emissions 22% by 2020. And by the way, that would save American consumers $327 billion a year. This is a tremendous opportunity to achieve savings, generate economic activity, and pay a dividend economically as well as environmentally.
Well, and Representative, if I might just add to that statement, the many discussions I have had with constituents who say, where is the wisdom in sending hundreds of billions of dollars to foreign nations, oftentimes enemies to this country, who are using the American energy consumer dollars to train troops to fight our sons and daughters on the battlefield. This is a no-brainer. This gluttonous dependency on fossil-based fuels imported to keep our energy agenda alive has got to stop, and we need to move forward, again, with the progressive thinking that I know we can embrace in this House, get it done. So I thank you again for leadership in this dimension.
And that last element is one that makes it so surprising that my Republican friends don't want to talk about dealing with climate change and energy efficiency on the floor, especially given the fact that an amazing, stellar array of distinguished foreign policy and military experts who have identified climate change and fossil fuel dependency as a strategic vulnerability for this country, and why they have argued that we ought to move forward aggressively dealing with climate change, dealing with energy efficiency, because it strengthens America rather than sending dollars, as you point out, to people who don't necessarily share our interests or our beliefs. It has been pointed out more than once that we are financing both sides of the war on terror. But I would like to turn, if I could, to my friend from Memphis, Congressman Cohen, who started us off this evening with a terrific one-minute observation about Dr. Hansen's retirement, and we would welcome your thoughts and further observations about our moving forward.
Thank you. I appreciate your leadership on this issue and your scheduling this special order. Dr. James Hansen did retire. He is considered the foremost climatologist in the world, and as I understand it, he shared in a Nobel Prize in 2007 on this general type of issue. And he's been the leading proponent of our watching out for the future, and the Keystone Pipeline been he's the clarion call, I guess. He's on the problems that would cause to the environment in the future, because the tar sands to mine is a very carbon intensive activity, and you take away the forest, you also have to use a lot of water and a lot of energy in the production, and just the production of the tar sands causes a great damage to the environment, let alone the potential for damage to our country when they would travel through the pipelines, and then when they're burnt, it's another, that's, I guess, lighting the carbon bomb and letting it go off. But Dr. Hansen studied climate and was one of the first to warn on this issue, and he has retired, so we'll have his voice. I live in Memphis, and it's kind of the center of the region, Oklahoma over, with tornadoes, and tornadoes have been much, much more prominent in the United States. And this just didn't occur. Mother Nature can have her times and certain variances in her schedule, but it's obvious what's been happening with the increase in tornadoes, the drought, the floods. The Mississippi River's it's been the lowest spots it's ever been, and it's flooded. It had the worst floods in Memphis ever about 2-3 years ago, and this year the river was its lowest. We've gone from its highest to its lowest, and something's happening. It's obvious something's happening, and scientists almost to a one tell us that this is because of what we've done to the environment. There might be 2 out of 100 scientists, and it seems so unfortunate that the other side always grabs 1 or 2 of those people, and rather than the 98. We all have a debt and a duty to protect the earth, and I think that looking out for issues where we do conserve, as you've said, I've got a company in Memphis I met with last week. They're really in Mississippi, called Griffin, and they have found a way to come up with a system that when a vehicle idles, and they're talking about, in their specific situation, armored cars who have a lot of going around, and they idle their engines when they pick up their financial deposits. It costs a lot to the environment, and the burning of oil when the car's running. And they've got a way where the car can be turned off and the idling the engine can stop, but nevertheless the vehicle still gets air conditioning and power, and it can save a tremendous amount of gasoline and protect the environment. Hopefully they can come within some grants that are already available to make companies that need to retrofit their vehicles to use that. But it is like raising our CAFE standards, that we have the save electricity, or save energy is the best way to save it, is not to have to use it and to conserve on that. So there are opportunities we have. Obviously we have to concentrate on this. We've got to look to alternatives, and wind and solar are two of them, but it's a disaster waiting to happen, and we just can't close our eyes to it. It's important that we take a leadership role in the world. And as Mr. Blumenauer, I'd like to ask you, with the Defense Department that made this question, raised those issues about it being important to our national defense, were they referring to the droughts that they foresaw coming in the future with climate change and what might happen in some of those countries where they have less opportunity to produce food and have water, et cetera?
Well, the threats are manifold. One is just when we are subjecting our armed services to try and deal with the extremes that you talked about. It's unpredictable. They have to be dealing with drought, with flood, extreme weather events. When we find the disruption that occurs in other parts of the world with drought, with famine, that provides an instability that creates a security challenge for us. And the fact that we are vulnerable still in terms of energy supply for the United States and for our allies, and the world economy can be held hostage. All of these were part of this challenge. Last but not least, the Department of Defense, the United States military, is the largest consumer of energy in the world. Energy supply, energy cost, energy efficiency is a matter of military readiness and operational efficiency. When we spend $18 billion for air conditioning in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's a drain on the budget. When we are sending to the front in tanker trucks, because we are so dependent on fossil fuel, they might as well have a great big bullseye on them. We've lost thousands of Americans on these fuel convoys. So being able to be energy efficient, being able to stretch the dollars, being able to promote American security is all part of an equation where these experts are saying it ought to be a no-brainer to move forward with energy efficiency, and security experts are deeply concerned about the disruptive impact globally of this uncertain climate effect. Now, I've noticed that we are joined by my colleague from the state of Oregon, Congresswoman Bonamici, who has long exercised leadership in areas of environment and energy in her previous career as a distinguished state legislator in Oregon. I welcome her and would invite comments in a conversation with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Blumenauer, for leading this discussion about such an important topic. You know, the reality of what we're talking about is really impossible to deny. We've had numerous scientists testify in Congress, and you mentioned Dr. Hansen, and I want to mention that his first testimony in Congress was 25 years ago. 1988 was the first time that Dr. Hansen, a well-renowned NASA scientist, testified about the problems of climate change. 25 years ago. And since, so many peer-reviewed studies have shown the reality of what we're facing and the human impact and significant contributing factor. Not only do we have a lot of impacts on the planet, from glacial withdrawal and loss of sea ice, ocean acidification, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, we're feeling the impact here in our country with record droughts in the American Southwest and historic severe weather events. You probably have already mentioned that according to National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and to NASA, last year, 2012, was the warmest year on record for the United States, and the 9 warmest years on record have all occurred since 1998. I wanted to talk for a minute, Mr. Blumenauer, about some of the effects that we're feeling in our home state of Oregon. We have a reputation for quality wine grapes, including the world-renowned Pinot Noir grape. The quality of wine is attributable to the climate in Oregon, and the Pinot grapes grow in temperature range from 57 and 61 degrees, and a minor variation threatens the qualities of the grapes and the value, significant value to Oregon's economy. Also, the district that I represent, and I know you've been out to our Oregon coast frequently, it includes shellfish industry, and there's a thriving fishing community there. There's Dungeness crab for sale on the commercial market, recreational crabbing that helps draw tourists over to the coast. But in recent years, the changes have caused low oxygen content in the water. Hypoxia is the condition that results. It's creating dead zones in our ocean that kill fish, crab, and other marine life. This is a serious problem that's affecting the industry over there. There's a shellfish hatchery, Whiskey Creek, over in Tillamook that supplies 3/4 of the oyster seed to produce shellfish up and down the West Coast. It's an industry worth $110 million annually. Their stock of oyster seed is being threatened by the rising acidity of the ocean, which is, again, a serious impact of climate change. So right there in Oregon, there's just 2 examples, economic examples, of how our local industry is being affected. And Oregonians, I know, as well as people around this country, they're looking to us for solutions. They're looking for us for leadership. So we need to discuss how we're going to mitigate and begin to reverse these environmental and economic effects. We have a great responsibility, not only to our own home states, but to our country and the rest of the world. And we need to take a leadership role.
I appreciate that comment. I was just thinking as you were describing the threats on our Oregon coast to what we just read in the Washington Post a couple of days ago here, where the impacts of climate change are having a profound effect on the blue crab. They're breeding a super crab that's actually, they're growing more rapidly. At the same time, climate impacts are weakening the oysters, making them more vulnerable. So the potential here of completely disrupting this critical part of the ecosystem in the Chesapeake Bay. Well, I appreciate very much your joining in this conversation. You know, I wish that our Republican friends would join us in the invitation to actually debate this issue in the finest tradition of the House of Representatives. There was a time when in this chamber there were echoes of great challenge, debate, where people went back and forth with ideas to be able to bring out the best in us. We actually saw that when the Republicans took control 23 months ago, one of the first things they did was abolish the special committee on climate change and global warming. And since then, we haven't really had an opportunity to engage in this fashion.
I appreciate your bringing up the idea of the hottest year. And in Memphis, it does occasionally get hot. But it also does in Washington. And I think it's supposed to be 90 today. I suspect, somebody's going to be able to prove me wrong, but this may be the hottest.
It's an all-time record for today.
I figured it was, and it's just unbelievable. And last week it was cold. I mean, I had my winter suit when I went home, and I brought my summer stuff here today. And the heat it does have effects. And you brought up some of the other issues. It's not just the polar bears, but I'm a big fan of the polar bears. And they're going to be eliminated because they're going to lose their ability to survive in their natural climate, and the flora and the fauna are at risk. But what Mr. Blumenauer mentioned about defense made me think a long time ago, and to me it was when I was in college, and it was a man I thought a lot of named Don Wolfson, smart man from a family that had sophisticated knowledge of power in this country, and we were talking about who was the most powerful person in the country and what were the most powerful interests. And I said something about the military-industrial complex. And President Eisenhower warned us in his last address about the military-industrial complex. And what he warned us about really was the impact they'd have on the budget and all those things. But what he told me, Don Wolfson, he said, but the military-industrial complex is all tied to one thing, and it's oil. That's what it's about. And a lot of the military, because it runs on oil, and Mr. Blumenauer so well pointed out, they're the most consuming user of oil, and they also, at the same time, are spending much of their efforts defending the trade routes to get oil, and that's why the Fifth Fleet's over there in Bahrain, and it's defending the Straits of Hormuz, and why Iran has a particular significance in the Middle East. So, it's amazing what President Eisenhower warned us, and I don't know if that was part of his warning, but maybe there was more truth to what he said, and we probably should spend a part of each day reflecting on President Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex and what it has done to our nation, because that's where the budget's really got a great problem. And that all goes back to our dependence on foreign oil.
Sure. And if I may add, too, that calls out for continued investment in alternative technologies and energy, from electric vehicles to hybrid vehicles to alternative fuels, solar power, wind power.
Bicycling.
We need to continue. Bicycles, of course, bicycles. We need to continue that research and investment in those alternative technologies to decrease our dependence on foreign fuel. And one of the things that I want to mention, too, what we have debated here on the floor is how much we're going to spend to clean up after disasters. And that is something that we have debated here on the floor. I want to point out that a recent GAO report for the first time lists climate change as a significant financial risk to the federal government. We're not well positioned to address the fiscal exposure presented by climate change. So as a nation, we become too familiar with consequences of waiting until the 11th hour to develop solutions. The time is now to work together to begin to reverse these changes, to develop alternative technologies, to come up with policies that will begin to take on this very serious problem and build our economy at the same time. And even for those who dispute or ignore the scientific evidence of climate change, we can still discuss the economic gains we can make by investing in a clean energy economy and modernizing our infrastructure and seeking energy independence, which is also a national security issue as well, as you mentioned.
Absolutely. Those 11 weather disasters last year cost us over $60 billion. And it's creating uncertainty in agriculture. It's creating uncertainty in the business of insurance, where it's more difficult for them to be able to calculate what they're doing. It places more burden on the federal government because in many cases there aren't private alternatives available. It's why we had to create flood insurance. You're touching on an area that has profound economic consequences because of this environmental instability.
Right. Mr. Blumenauer, let me ask you this, and we've worked together on the Keystone XL issue. When people come to you and say, it's going to create all these jobs, and we need jobs, and they can get this oil, this tar sands to China if they need to by going to the West, what do you tell folks about those jobs and the effect that it'll have on the future?
Well, it's very important for us to take a step back and evaluate exactly what the economic employment opportunities are. Because things that we do to rebuild and renew America in a sustainable way. Keystone has a few thousand temporary construction jobs and maybe a handful. I've heard various estimates, a few dozen, a couple hundred permanent jobs. And has, as you point, significant environmental consequences. But when we're investing in wind, solar, geothermal, these are areas that are producing far more jobs already, and that they are using a sustainable source of energy that pays a continuing dividend over time. This wind is American. This geothermal energy is American, and it's renewable, and it doesn't cost us anything.
And they're just Memphis borders Arkansas, and there was some kind of a pipeline problem over there recently. I think it might have been Exxon, but they had a leak, and that's kind of an expensive process. And that's similar to the Keystone pipeline, isn't it? Gives us kind of a warning of what could occur.
Well, energy transmission is something that is a part of the broader equation. Pipeline reliability is something that we all need to be concerned about. But more fundamentally, we need to deal with the sources of energy, what is driving them, how we reduce carbon emissions, not how sort of we shift the pieces around. The priority, I think, ought to be sustainable energy, more economic investment, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not cooking the planet. I recently had my first two grandchildren in a course of a few months. It was interesting to me, some of these dry debates that we have that talk about, well, by 2100, sea levels may rise 3 or 4. That always seemed kind of remote to me until I realized that these two young men, if they live as long as their great-grandmother, will be alive in the year 2100. And what we do as a Congress helps shape the world that they inherit.
Absolutely.
That's our responsibility. It's why I deeply appreciate both of you being part of this discussion this evening, and why I hope that our Republican friends will join us in an actual debate of these policies, practices, what the choices are, and hopefully it may actually lead to action in the floor of the House for a more sustainable future.
I know we join you in that. I also wanted to mention, while you're talking about renewable energy, the great promise of wave energy as well with the coast. And I don't have any grandchildren, but I know you do.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair and not to others in the second person.
Thank you,
Gentleman,
Mr.
may
Speaker.
continue.
I know that Mr. Blumenauer has grandchildren. I don't yet, but we owe it not only to the current generation, but to future generations to take action on these important issues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And I'm prepared to yield back unless my friend from Memphis wants any concluding comment.
I just want to thank you for your leadership, and it's been an honor to join you today on the floor, and this issue is important to be addressed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. We yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.